spaceship near Moscow recently has once again stirred up the public debate about UFOs. Although the reports about 10-foot-tall aliens have been dismissed as nonsense by most people, there are many who would argue that UFO landings can and have occurred, not only in the USSR, but in the U.S. and other countries. Have UFOs been given a fair shake by science, journalism, and the government? George Knapp joins us now with part one of a cover story series, UFOs, the Best Evidence. George?
Well, Gary and Mary Ruth, some people might object to the use of the words UFOs and evidence in the same sentence. However, there is now a staggering amount of information on this subject, collected not by crackpots, but by respected, mainstream, level-headed people who want to know what, if anything, is going on. What we've tried to do is sift through as much of this information as possible to see if there's anything to it. In part one of UFOs, the Best Evidence, we explore whether the subject has been treated fairly by the establishment.
If you have a question, feel free to give us a call. Hi, you're next on the Billy Goodman thing on KVEG. The eggplant that ate Chicago, you remember that, huh?
And what was your encounter like, may I ask?
Billy Goodman's radio talk show is heard nightly in 10 western states, stretching from Canada to Mexico. Previously, the topic of choice was Elvis Presley's present whereabouts, but the focus drifted into UFOs, and Goodman's phone lines have been lit up ever since.
Oh, well, tell us about the last time when you were abducted, the very last time.
3 hours a night, 6 nights a week, the calls come in. Some callers claim to have been abducted by aliens. Other callers say they are aliens. This is pretty wild stuff.
Tell me about it. But this is what we get, and it goes on and on and on.
The popularity of Goodman's show is but one indication of the persistent public hunger for UFO lore. Despite discouragement by government, science, and religion, this is a story that will not go away. Is it the most pervasive and long-standing mass delusion in human history, or is something else at work here? Prominent sociologists have argued that even if there are no flying saucers or extraterrestrials, the stubborn durability of the UFO legend makes it worthy of study.
ET phone.
The human fascination with extraterrestrials is reflected in our most popular films and in popular TV programs. ET books are often perched atop bestseller lists. UFO updates grace the pages of mass circulation magazines. There are UFO hotlines and ET newsletters. Flying saucers have invaded the comic strips. UFO researchers like John Lear play to packed houses at library lectures. UFO organizations stage annual symposiums at which conventioneers can buy UFO tapes and UFO keychains, hats, and booklets, and more. I was abducted by aliens, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. Flying saucers are big business, but the profiteering seems incidental to the enduring interest. Millions of people who have nothing to gain believe in UFOs. The most recent Gallup poll shows that nearly 60% of college-educated American adults believe that UFOs are extraterrestrial craft. The higher the education, the more likely the belief in UFOs.
We have a society today which accepts the basic notion of space travel, of visits by different kinds of beings to other places. That's a big step in just one generation.
But it's not merely a matter of blind faith. More than 20 million Americans say they've seen a UFO. 70,000 new sightings are reported each year. Even the most ardent UFO converts will concede that up to 90% of these sightings are mistakes, misidentifications of planets, or of conventional aircraft, or of military flares, or weather balloons, or other little-known natural phenomena. While it's true that 9 out of every 10 sightings is probably wrong, it's also true that only 1 in 10 sightings is ever reported at all. In general, these sightings are made by normal, well-balanced people who have nothing to gain and much to lose by stepping forward.
It was dark, there was 3 or 4 of us running along, and all of a sudden it was daylight, just brighter than all get out, and yet you could see over yonder that it was dark.
A tremendous streak just shot out of nowhere from the right and basically tailgated this plane. And it followed the plane for a very short period, and then it just stopped.
No noise, nothing. The same bright red color, and wasn't blinking or nothing. It was just like a ball of light.
What I saw were these balls of light traveling from the west to the east, all the way across the sky.
And there was lights all around it, the same color as the ship, and it was rotating. It was doing all kinds of maneuvers, zigzag movements, go fast this way and then that way, and then would flip over. And I saw this huge saucer-shaped vehicle, which it was brightly lit, and it appeared to have dark areas, portholes of some sort.
Did you see that? You know, did you see that? You know, and everybody saw it, but nobody had an explanation.
I do know what I saw.
It wasn't a plane.
It wasn't a plane. It wasn't a helicopter.
It wasn't a weather balloon.
It wasn't a weather balloon. It wasn't a satellite.
It wasn't swamp gas.
It wasn't swamp gas. It wasn't any kind of light by itself. There was an actual object.
Many UFO sightings occur in broad daylight. Many involve multiple witnesses. The witnesses include pilots and policemen, even a president, people who are trained to be observant and whose judgment is trusted. The sightings date back to the dawn of recorded history in every country and every culture. UFOs have been around much longer than conventional aircraft, much longer than science fiction writers. There are even references in the Bible to UFO sightings. Some of this might count as evidence in a court of law, but it means very little to establishment science. Most scientists have little regard for UFOs, although few have studied the subject to any significant degree. Odd, considering that mainstream science now vigorously believes that intelligent life elsewhere in the universe is a virtual certainty. Even UFO skeptic Carl Sagan has estimated there may be more than 1 million advanced civilizations in our galaxy alone. Congressional hearings have delved into the possibility, and millions of dollars are spent each year listening for radio signals from deep space. But organized science declines to peek over the fence into its own backyard.
The probability of there being another civilization both near us and sufficiently close to us in evolution that they would either can or would be willing to communicate, seems to be a fairly rare thing. Just the probabilities suggest that would be a very rare thing.
Any scientist that takes the time to look at the data and the facts and the evidence accepts the fact that we have UFOs. You have to have an open mind if you simply make the statement that there's nothing to this thing and ignore it. People like Carl Sagan, who's a brilliant astrophysicist, he's never bothered to read the UFO material. To him, there's nothing there, so don't bother me with the facts.
In more than 22 years as a hobby of investigating famous, mysterious UFO cases, reports, I have never found one that cannot be explained in prosaic earthly terms.
Phil Klass bills himself as the Sherlock Holmes of UFOs and is the world's preeminent debunker. He shows up at nearly all of the UFO conventions, a fly in the ET ointment. Phil Klass dartboards are best-selling items at many of those same conventions. Klass takes that as a compliment. His success at belittling or ridiculing UFO sightings is beyond question, but few people will accuse Klass of sticking to the scientific method. Even UFO doubters concede that Klass has been dead wrong in his explanations of some sightings, that he distorts astronomy for his own purposes, that he accuses UFO witnesses of being liars or hoaxsters, even though he rarely investigates any sightings personally.
Even experienced airline pilots, military pilots, can be grossly in error in what they think they've seen.
Many UFO researchers are convinced that Klass is a government agent. His years of work as editor for the well-connected aerospace mouthpiece Aviation Week and Space Technology is suspicious to some.
I cannot believe that anybody could so persistently be wrong, over and over again making claims which are false demonstrably and so forth, without having been told or doing something that he feels is in the patriotic best interest of the country. He's not so stupid. In the 50s and 60s, it was standard practice for the intelligence agencies to recruit journalists. Mr. Klass, as the outstanding example of that, was, after all, unmarried, very fast typewriter, electrical engineering background, in Washington, D.C., all kinds of contacts, a perfect person to be a spy for either side, for that matter. And so if he wasn't recruited, somebody goofed.
You ever work for the government in any capacity?
Never been paid a penny, except when my dear mother died and I got a Social Security benefit.
Phil Klass and other debunkers don't have to work very hard to create doubt about UFOs. The subject has attracted more than its share of crazies over the years. The U.S. government has officially decreed that UFOs are bunk. Science has followed suit. Have they been studied to the extent that they need to be?
I don't think they have been studied to the extent they need to be. There really should be more study, but again, the problem is most credible scientists have other things that they feel safer doing You know, just because of the fringe elements associated with UFOs.
The funding thing hanging over your head, too. I mean, you said you can't get...
Oh, hey, you apply to the National Science Foundation, you want to study UFOs, they're going to laugh and throw it out.
Without question, there is a strong streak of wacko within the UFO field. Consider the tabloid headlines wherein psychics invite aliens to a Monday night football game, or a girl gives birth to 52 UFO babies, right there alongside the capture of a green Bigfoot and the Wild Bill Hickok was gay expose. Also, psychics and channelers advertise that aliens speak to us through them. I'll tell you what, I'd like to see this sometime.
Okay, that's why I'm here, bud.
You mean you could do it now?
Right now. I want to ask for whatever information comes through to be of interest, perhaps even amusing if that's called for, and whatever energy that comes through do not affect the taping. Speaking. Well, I will respond to questions.
Shapiro seems sincere enough, but admits there's no way to verify his claim, and he doesn't care much whether people believe him or not. This approach is a bit too casual for science. The same is true of big-time journalism. Network coverage is quirky and condescending.
So what was it? Way up there. Heaven only knows. And that's our news.
Do you believe in UFOs? Nah.
An official Soviet government news agency has reported that a UFO landed recently near Moscow, complete with 10-foot-tall aliens from space. The reporter said his source was a group of children, and a scientist said, don't believe everything you read in TASS.
It's something that people just don't want to deal with, the press doesn't want to deal with, and people aren't going to listen to something unless Dan Rather or any of your big press people are going to tell them about it. And they're just too spooked. The Air Force has made an art form of ridiculing people who have talked about this thing.
This seeming reluctance by journalism, science, government, and religion to fully explore the possibility of extraterrestrial visits has left the job in the hands of untrained, underfunded private organizations and individuals. Invariably, such private efforts attract people whose minds are already made up and whose approach is far from professional or scientific. Ufology has made important strides in recent years, but when you consider that contact with an alien civilization would surely rank as one of the most significant events in human history, it would seem that a more organized type of study might be warranted.
If we know anything about science, it is this: the truth is always changing. What is science fiction today is science tomorrow. For instance, back in the 1800s, the scientific establishment scoffed at persistent reports from peasants and farmers and other country folk about rocks that fell from the sky. It took more than 100 years for the French Academy of Sciences to finally concede that meteorites were real. And just one generation ago, most scientists would have argued that life beyond the Earth is impossible. That is no longer the dominant viewpoint. In the days ahead, we will take you inside the government's own files to examine previously secret studies of the UFO phenomenon. We'll also try to find out if there is any connection between UFOs and the mutilations of cattle and other animals taking place across the West. We will explore what impact an alien landing might have on religion and other social institutions, and we will reveal the identity of this man who says the government has already established contact with aliens and is testing alien technology right here in Nevada.
Now, George, you said that UFO groups have made improvements. Is ufology a real science now?
Well, they call it ufology, but even they will concede it's not really a science. It is making strides. If you take MUFON, for example, the Mutual UFO Network, they restrict their membership only to people who are invited, so you weed out some of the crackpots. Their membership has doubled in the last 2 years. They have 75 PhDs who serve not only as members but consultants. You know, there have been college courses taught on UFOs now on several campuses, and 8 PhDs have been written on the subject. So it's not a science, but it's moving in that direction.
A lot of people aren't going to believe it until they see absolute proof. What would be proof?
Well, we'll be talking about through the course of the week, but I mean, if eyewitnesses millions of eyewitnesses count as proof in other kinds of proceedings. You got photos, you got movie footage, you got video, you've got all kinds of physical manifestations, radiation, landing sites, things of that nature. It's the totality is what you really have to look at, and of course we'll be taking a look at what constitutes proof through the course of the next several days.
Okay, George. Sounds great.
Forward to part two. Thank you, George.
The term flying saucer was first coined back in 1947. Businessman Kenneth Arnold, who made the first major UFO sighting of the post-war era, told reporters that the UFOs he saw near Tacoma floated across the sky like a saucer skipping across the water. The name stuck. There have been thousands of sightings since then, according to some. There have also been UFO crashes with the evidence supposedly hidden by the government. George Knapp checks out some of those claims tonight in part two of our series, UFOs, the best evidence. George?
Mary Ruth and Gary, we mentioned last night that there is a large body of information about UFOs. How much of this constitutes evidence is another matter altogether. In some cases, it does appear that various government officials have withheld information about UFOs from the public. In other cases, the waters have been muddied by the UFO researchers themselves. Tonight, we examine two of the most controversial incidents.
Billy Meier is a one-armed Swiss farmer with a sixth-grade education, an unlikely choice to pull off the world's most sophisticated UFO hoax. Since 1975, Meier says, he's been in contact with cosmonauts from the Pleiades star cluster. Meier isn't the first to claim extraterrestrial visitations, but he is the first to document contact in such stunning detail, with more than 800 photographs of strange aircraft. Not the fuzzy, phony UFO photos the world is accustomed to, but clear daylight pictures of multiple flying discs and identifiable reference points in the foreground and background.
The Meier photographs were the best we'd ever seen in 40 years of record keeping. In fact, the quote we kept getting is, "They're too good to be true."
Lee Elder says he wanted his face hidden because of some ongoing security work. He also says he was coaxed into investigating the Meier case by retired Air Force Colonel Wendell Stevens. Elder, Stevens, and others spent 5 years chasing after Billy Meier's beam ships. The evidence included the photos, of course, but also film footage and sound recordings. More than 40 eyewitnesses who substantiated Meier's claims, small pieces of strange metal, and reputed landing sites with the same swirling impressions that 10 years later would be associated with UFOs in England and other countries. Instead of turning to UFO researchers, Elders and Stevens went to independent experts for their analysis. An IBM chemist concluded the strange metal was produced in a cold fusion process, a technology that only now is in its infancy on Earth. Hollywood special effects artists said the photos and film footage would be extremely difficult to fake, and computer analysis of the photos by NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab and 2 universities found no evidence of a hoax. The bottom line, outside experts independently decided the Meier material is legitimate.
I am personally 98% convinced that Meier did have visitations. 2% I reserve because it didn't happen to me.
However, the UFO community, angry at being excluded from the investigation, declared Meier a hoax. Unsubstantiated stories were circulated that the Meier photos were of models suspended from a fishing pole.
Number one, what's his motive? It's not ego, it's not money. Number two, how could he do it on the resources he had, $500 equivalent, Swiss francs per month? I don't think one man could hoax this case. I don't think a team of men could hoax it. How do you get 40 people to agree to a hoax over a period of time up to 8-10 years?
The Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, also considers the Meier case to be a hoax, mainly because Meier would not cooperate with MUFON's attempted investigation. UFO hoaxes do happen. People build backyard saucers or take snapshots of flying hubcaps, but fakes are rare. Even the Air Force Project Blue Book found few phonies.
The number of hoaxes was fewer than 5%. The number of unknowns were more than 20%. The number of psychological aberrations, beautiful way to say crackpot cases, was 2%. The hoaxers may get more press than they deserve because there are a lot of lazy media people around.
It's more than lazy media, though. The Meier case, for instance, illustrates ufology's most glaring weakness, the suspicion and jealousy that permeate the field. It sometimes seems as if everyone wants to be the only one who knows the true UFO story. UFO believers end up using the same tactics as UFO skeptics, ostracizing those whose ideas don't conform. Ask John Lear. His contention that ETs are evil is so far askew from mainstream UFO thinking that some MUFON members resigned during a recent symposium rather than even listen to Lear. Lear was accused of spreading government disinformation, the most serious insult that can be made in UFO circles. Ironically, one man who made that charge, author Bill Moore, admitted at that same symposium that he had been duped into disseminating false data planted by the government. Would the government really go to such lengths to discredit UFO researchers? It has, and it does.
Some examples. The first man to make a modern sighting, Kenneth Arnold, was investigated by the FBI, CIA, and IRS. They thought he must be some sort of commie spy to make such a report. Later on, CIA experts devised a systematic program of spying on UFO organizations. In one case, a UFO club was not only infiltrated by the CIA, but CIA agents were elected as its officers. CIA scientists, pondering how to make UFO witnesses keep quiet, talked about getting Walt Disney to produce cartoons that ridiculed UFO sightings. They also planned to get broadcaster Arthur Godfrey involved at one point, and most recently, a former Air Force officer with a long history of spreading false UFO information appeared with his face hidden on a national UFO broadcast to explain that the U.S. has alien beings in its custody and that they love to eat strawberry ice cream. To some, all of this has the makings of a government conspiracy.
That's exactly what it is. The government's been lying to the public for 42 years. It's very, very difficult to go back and say, admit that we've been lying to you.
42 years is a long time for the government to keep anything a secret, let alone something as sensational as UFOs. UFO researchers couldn't agree more. They say there have been huge cracks in the cover-up, but that the public and press haven't been listening. At the center of this whole scenario is the conservative New Mexico town, Roswell, which in 1947 was home to the Roswell Army Air Base.
These days, the locals use these old airstrips to race dragsters and the old hangars as an industrial park. But 42 years ago, this is where it all began, the birthplace of what some have called the Cosmic Watergate.
What happened on that night in July 1947 sounds like the plot of an old science fiction movie. Residents saw a bright object streak across the sky. 70 miles out of town, it exploded, scattering debris over a large area. Rancher Mac Brazel found the strange metallic fragments and days later reported the matter to authorities. Roswell intelligence officer Major Jesse Marcel was dispatched to the scene to collect the wreckage.
One thing I was certain of, being familiar with all air activities, that it was not a weather balloon, nor an aircraft, nor a missile. It was something else of which we didn't know what it was.
Marcel said the thin foil-like metal was virtually indestructible, with strange hieroglyphics written on it. In his words, it was not of this earth. Base Commander Colonel William Blanchard, certainly familiar with all aircraft of the day, agreed. He called up his press liaison, Lieutenant Walter Hott.
He called and said words to this effect: "We've got pieces of what we think is a flying saucer."
Hott wrote and released a story that was immediately picked up by newspapers and wire services, spurring phone calls from all over the world. Major Marcel was told to load the wreckage into a B-29 and fly it to Wright Field in Ohio. He landed first at 8th Air Force Headquarters in Fort Worth, where General Roger Ramey took control of the debris, ordered Marcel and others to keep quiet, and issued another news release saying the debris was actually from a crashed weather balloon. As he and Marcel posed for reporters with debris from a balloon, the real wreckage, according to witnesses, was flown under armed guard to Ohio.
The newsmen saw very little of that material, a very small portion of it. And none of the important things, like these members that had these hieroglyphics or markings on. And when the general came in, he told me not to say anything, that he would handle it.
The story held for 30 years until Stan Friedman and his colleagues started digging. They found more than 100 witnesses with first or second-hand knowledge of the Roswell incident. They also believe that the debris was from an alien spacecraft that crashed miles beyond the Brazel Ranch. Numerous witnesses say they saw the crashed disc, the bodies of dead aliens inside. But the military seized the evidence and swore them to secrecy. Walter Hott says flat out the story of the weather balloon was a cover-up. So does Bob Shirky. Shirky was the officer who ordered up the B-29 that transported the strange debris. He saw the wreckage and thinks if it really was from a weather balloon, it wouldn't have been flown to Ohio in such a hurry. Shirky also has knowledge of the alien bodies. The information is from a close friend who ran the town funeral parlor in the 40s. It has never been made public until now.
Did you see the sketches in the paper of the humanoids or the bodies? And I said, yes. He says, well, I can tell you that's what they look like. Says our funeral parlor supplied the caskets for the Air Force to use because we had the contract. And they came in and took all the baby-sized or youth-sized caskets we had.
What would an alien spacecraft be doing in Roswell in the first place? Well, in the late 40s and early 50s, New Mexico had more UFO sightings than any other place in the world. Consider one possible explanation. It was at Los Alamos that the atomic bomb was developed and built. The Trinity site is where the first A-bomb was detonated. White Sands is where all post-war missile tests were conducted. And Roswell was home to the 509th, the only atomic bomb wing in the world. If an alien intelligence wanted to learn about human military capabilities, New Mexico was the place to be. The strange sightings and somewhat flimsy excuses continued long after the alleged Roswell crash. Lonnie James was an Air Force radar operator in Roswell in the 50s. He recalls at least 3 instances when UFOs were picked up on radar and seen from the ground. Jets were scrambled, but they couldn't get close.
The sweep on the radar comes around every 5 seconds. The rate of speed was so great, we could not, it disappeared off the radar before we could get a, check the speed on them.
How fast is that?
Well, it was well over 2,000, well over.
The official explanation for what James and others saw, the ubiquitous excuse, weather balloons.
I think you know as well as I do, George, that weather balloons do not behave in that fashion.
Of course, UFO buffs smell a cover-up. But what about the level-headed people of Roswell? Do they believe that a flying saucer crashed outside their town?
I don't know percentage-wise what the difference would be, but I think after the recent exposure, I think that really a lot of people believe it.
An odd footnote to the story. In September, the Roswell incident was featured on the NBC program Unsolved Mysteries. Within days of that broadcast, the people of Roswell started seeing weather balloons. During our interview with Walter Hott, a weather balloon floated over his backyard. Another was spotted on the drive from Roswell to Albuquerque. Is there a vital need for weather data in the New Mexican desert, or is someone trying to prove something? Former U.S. Senator Barry Goldwater thinks there's something fishy about the whole story. As chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee and an Air Force general, Goldwater had a top-secret security clearance. During a visit to Wright-Patterson Air Base in Ohio, he asked to view the hangar where the Roswell wreckage and other UFO information were reportedly stored. Permission was denied. Goldwater later wrote that he was told the matter was classified above top secret. He was also told to never ask again. What does the government know that it isn't telling us? Tomorrow, we'll delve into the government's own files to find out if the cover-up is real and ongoing. And later, we'll reveal the identity of this man who says the government is flying alien craft in the Nevada desert.
It's not only a crime against the American people, it's a crime against the scientific community.
Speculation about some long-standing government cover-up is tough for many people to swallow. Tomorrow, as we mentioned, we'll look at files obtained through the Freedom of Information Act to see if there's a real basis for the cover-up allegations.
Back to the first part of the story, Billy Meyer, the one-armed farmer. What happened to him?
He's still alive, living on his farm in Switzerland, but we understand from Lee Elders that things have changed considerably for him, that he's real despondent these days, and these visits from the Pleiadian cosmonauts, if they ever happened, have stopped.
What do UFO critics say about the Roswell incident?
Well, Phil Klass, for example, of course, who buys none of this stuff, he basically says that all of the witnesses involved are lying. Either they're lying or they're hoaxsters. Of course, it's also been proven that of the over 100 people with first or second-hand degree knowledge of the Roswell incident, not one has been interviewed by Phil Klass.
Interesting. Thank you, George.
See you tomorrow night.